want to start this conversation. I think it's really interesting that we had a nice conversation, a report from the art committee about the actions that they are taking to engage artists here in Seattle, and all of that being connected to the reopening of downtown Seattle. So I want to start with you, Brian. If you would please paint a picture for everyone here today, what it looked like and what your job, a day in the life of Brian Carter, pre-pandemic, when For Culture was working, all guns loaded.
Sorry about that. Apparently I can't unmute myself. Let's see where to start. Picture it. It's Sicily, 1936. No, that's just a Golden Girls joke. Like, anybody else like Golden Girls? No? All right. The actual date I want to take you back to is February 18th, 2020. This is before we're at home quarantining. This is before we realized the depth and I think the breadth of the damage that the COVID would bring us. And I'll tell you a little bit about For Culture. And just for some background, For Culture is the Cultural Development Authority of King County. So our purview are all the cities throughout King County. We serve primarily as a grant-making organization supporting arts organizations, cultural organizations, and individual artists and other cultural practitioners. And on February 18th, 2020, I look back at my calendar and it was just this kind of confluence of events that I think were such a wonderful time before we arrived where we were at. Three things that we were working on at For Culture at that moment. One was a finalization of our strategic plan. We had undertaken, and this is the first time the organization had undertaken a strategic planning process. We had taken about 2 years to really look closely at what was happening within the cultural sector. And we defined it as what is the cultural health of the various cities throughout the county that we are charged with hopefully supporting, looking after, and trying to evolve. And so through the course of those 2 years, we came up with 4 main priorities that we believe identified avenues of approach to address the needs that the cultural sector had. It was around cultural space. It was around networking. It was around funding models. It was an exciting time because what we were able to do is really wrap our arms around where the cultural sector was and chart a course forward with really deliberate plans. So that was a finalization of that strategic plan on February 18th. We also had a finance committee. It was a subcommittee of our board that was getting together, and they were just beginning to pull our 2021-2022 biennium budget together. And weren't those halcyon days? Lodging tax, which is our primary revenue source, was projected to be really high. It was going to have this dramatic increase over what it had been for the past few years. There were conferences that were flooding in. There were travelers that were coming into the region. We had so many folks who were arriving right on the cruise ships. It was going to be this amazing budget where we were going to be flush with more cash than we had ever had as an organization. So we were really excited to be putting together that budget because it would allow us to implement our strategic plan goals in a really concrete way. And lastly, on February 18th, just by happenstance, we opened up the applications for one of our newer programs, and it's entitled Building for Equity. And that program was designed to help organizations with either space renovation needs, right? A theater, a museum, a gallery that might want to do a renovation, or that might be looking to expand their footprint, or perhaps to build a new building. And the reason that this program was so excited is it really focused on For Culture's new mission, which is to look at racial equity and racially equitable outcomes in our funding choices. And the goal of this program was to actually help those organizations that had historically not been able to access a lot of capital and a lot of funds to be able to do these renovations or new builds. And we wanted to offer guidance and support and scaffolding for those organizations such that they would be competitive, not only within our own facilities funding opportunities, but for other sources, whether that be individual foundations or corporations. So all 3 of those things were happening. It was such an exciting moment, and we were moving forward with cash and with energy and with vision. And that's February 18th, 2020.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pardon the interruption, but just as we come out of his comments, Mr. Carter, if you have a chance to change your background virtual setting, the algorithm seems to be challenged. You're fading in and out of it. Please continue.
Thank you. Brian, yeah, you get a little bit dark unless you lean right into the screen and we kind of lose you. So thank you for that. So I think essentially in summary, it was all systems go. It was a really exciting time, and For Culture was looking forward to expanding the breadth and depth of support for the arts in King County. And then pandemic hit. So Josh, let's pop over to you and ask you to paint a picture of what one of the rosiest days perhaps might have looked like at Seattle Theater Group. I mean, you, I think, are going to share an example that is more than likely an anomaly, but was setting a trend for the way things might be going in the future. Tell us about it.
Absolutely, Vivian. I was going to share our work around Hamilton, which happened in March of 2018. And it was an anomaly. It's one of the largest things our organization ever attempted to do. And this just gives you a sense of what it looked like from our perspective and the community's perspective. Hamilton came to the Paramount and sat for 3 weeks of production work, essentially rehearsals, tweaking the show, launching a national tour, and then 6 weeks of performances, which turns out to be about 48 performances. There were anywhere from 70 to 180 people with Hamilton during that period of time. So those first 3 weeks, we saw upwards of 180 people. And then as the show got kicked off, started, less and less people were there. It was just primarily that touring cast, which turned out to be about 70, 75 people. The part that I am so proud of is something that we call EduHam, which is the Hamilton Education Program, which wound up serving nearly 5,000 students and teachers in Washington and Oregon, with 2 sold-out matinee performances, as well as an entire program that led up to that experience that got our young people involved in creating a similar type of work. Interestingly, these students and teachers came from 76 different schools, 76. In addition, we had collaborations set up across our community with 28 community-based organizations. Volunteers filled more than 1,400 positions over the entire run, which amounted to more than 5,000 hours of work. We had more than 350 local people employed during this time. The overall economic impact to the region is estimated to be around $75 million. That includes, local stagehand wardrobe and hair labor is nearly $1 million as part of that, just to give you a sense of scale. I think about 138,000 people came and experienced Hamilton. And it was a remarkable time, and just an example of the kind of community impact and economic impact the arts have in our region.
That's really great. Thank you so much. I think with both of your pictures, what is very clear is that the tourism industry that seeds a lot of the funding for culture is also stimulated by the arts, by programs like Hamilton. That's such a big deal. And most seasons you get some sort of big deal production that will sit down here and bring people from all over the Pacific Northwest region to spend their dollars and support the arts. Thank you both for that. You are both representative of large organizations. For Culture serves the entire county, has a hefty budget. Seattle Theater Group is the largest performing arts organization in our region. So tell us a little bit about what your connections are and what your vision is for those other arts organizations that are a critical part of the ecosystem, the mid-size and the small arts organizations. Josh, go ahead and speak to that, because you talked about creating over 28 partnerships for Hamilton alone.
Yeah, so I have long believed that the health of Seattle Theater Group, of any of the large institutions in our region, is a direct reflection to the health of the smaller to mid-sized organizations in the arts and our own connections directly with community-based organizations. That if we are not actively pursuing and nurturing relationships, not just in arts organizations, but like groups like El Centro de la Raza, we are not doing our work with the community and are not pursuing our own vision of being the people's theater, a place where all are welcomed and represented. And I've long believed that in our work, bringing artists to our stages, if we're able to create partnerships with, you know, organizations such as On the Boards, Langston, we are so much better off doing this hand in hand together, junto, than we are pursuing things on our own. The last thing we want to be is some big gorilla. I've always, I'm a musician at heart, and I don't like to think of us in terms of our scale. I recognize it's my responsibility to do that. But when we're operating at our best, I feel like we're still a bit of a DIY organization. Like, just let's giddy up, let's be punk rock, let's do it ourselves and do it together. You know, a DIY spirit, which is kind of coming out of a small business entrepreneurial zone, which is really the basis of all arts work.
Yeah. And I think to give an example of what something like that might look like, what would your work with an organization with a El Centro de la Raza look like? What kind of work? Because since they're not a performing arts organization, what would that look like?
Yeah, so I'll give you a concrete example. A few years back, we set out and we realized, you know, there are not enough Spanish-speaking artists and musicians on our stages. And so we wound up creating a partnership with the Council General of Mexico, as well as other institutions like El Centro de la Raza, to help us get the word out once we were able to pull these together. And I gotta say, the Council General of Mexico here in Seattle, what an incredible institution. And what they wound up doing for us, with us, should say, they went and checked in with their constituency and brought back to us a list of artists that la gente wants to see. La gente, like the people, want to see.
Nice.
And that led to, let's say, through September of 2018 through August of 2019, we presented just shy of 20 performances with Spanish-speaking artists at all three of our theaters, serving more than 28,000 people. And it was it is ongoing, and it is some of the most important work we can do. Artists like Natalia Lafourcade, Café Tacuba, La Santa Cecilia. And that's how we're able to work with community-based organizations, because we just can't operate, like take advertising out and expect people to know. We've got to make partnerships.
I thank you for that, because I think one of the things that is really important for us to push back against is this extraction method of partnership, where we go into a community and we take something out of it and we make it our own. And I think it's really important to also illustrate that these relationships are not always performance-based, but they are community networking and partnering based. So thank you so much for that. Brian, I know that programs like Building for Equity is an opportunity to really, really get into community engagement work. What other kinds of ways does For Culture work with small and mid-sized organizations, in addition to simply providing the needs that they have for resources?
Yeah, I think the most important thing For Culture tries to do is recognize what its role is in a larger funding landscape. So as a government entity, our highest purpose, right, is the highest public benefit. What is in the best interest of as many people as possible who live in King County? That is our North Star. That's not always true for an individual donor. That's not always true for a family foundation. That's not always true for a corporate foundation. And so I take that charge very seriously. And what comes along with that, I think, is an appreciation of the way in which the arts ecosystem has evolved, meaning, right, most cities, Seattle included, evolved in a particular way. There's a symphony, there is an opera, there are these large, right, arts organizations that tended to end up with a lot of government support, which then let individual donors and families and family foundations to know that those were solid bets or things that should be invested in. And what you end up with is a lot of those organizations, which historically have been helmed primarily by white folks, and a lot of the content, a lot of the what's underneath the vitrines in the museums, right, was reflected of where those dollars were coming from. And what you ended up in was a lot of communities throughout King County, historically and to this day, that found their narratives and their stories and their art forms and their performance methods marginalized, not as appreciated, not as supported. And that's something that we face today. So I think what For Culture tries to do, and this gets to your question about the sizes of organizations, is to realize that the evolution of these organizations has been so vastly different. I'll just conclude by saying that, this is for everybody on the call, before the pandemic, right, arts organizations have not been successfully capitalized. There were a lot of arts organizations, regardless of their size, right, who were struggling to make ends meet before the pandemic began. And so what I like to talk about is, when it comes to cultural funding, there's a blanket. That blanket is very thin to begin with. The margins are very thin to begin with, but there are a lot of larger organizations that tend to be urban centered, large population centers that are in the middle of that blanket. And what you end up with is a lot of small organizations, POC organizations, rural organizations that are on the edges of that funding blanket and don't have that level of support. So what we try and do is, not only with our own programs and our own efforts, is to include those smaller POC rural organizations in our outreach strategies. We try and move funding towards them in significant ways, a redistribution of wealth. And we also hope that that inspires, right, other funders, folks on this call, family foundations, corporations, to start thinking about, right, the historic inequities that have happened with cultural funding and how we might disrupt that pattern. Because, as Josh said, like, the fullness of humanity has got to be reflected in the arts, and that takes money, that takes support, that takes infrastructure, it takes institution building.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that's really important, and has always been important for me too, is the recognition of the interdependent nature of arts organizations in a particular geographic area, you know, not just geographic, but how important it is that, you know, everybody survives and thrives, that we're not just supporting the biggest things that's happening. You know, we're not just supporting Hamilton at the Paramount, but we're supporting the work that's being done in addition to Hamilton in community-based schools as well. So thank you so much for that. Brian, I'm gonna ask you to continue to talk a little bit about what you see as some of the biggest challenges that arts organizations and arts funders will be having are experiencing now as we're preparing to reopen, ramping back up, and moving into the future, which will not be normal by any one stretch of the imagination.
I'll give a I've got 4 ideas here, 3 of which are somewhat simple and straightforward, and one's a little bit more complicated. I think the challenges that all arts organizations, regardless of size, are going to face is audience reacquisition. How do folks re-engage? Do they feel safe enough to come back, to participate, to be involved? What does that look like, and what can you count on as far as audience participation? I think another issue that most organizations are going to be facing is it feasible, or is it a wise choice to continue the digital programming that so many folks move towards, right? Whether it was symphony, it was theater group, dance groups. A lot of folks went to a digital platform to try and share their content, right? Their interpretive work with the public. And the question is that financially feasible? Can it actually be revenue positive to continue doing that? And then lastly is a lot of organizations are undergoing budget crunches, budget crises, and that requires oftentimes adjustments to financial plans. It requires adjustments to strategic plans. And so I think that a lot of organizations are going to have to grapple with how they fund that, how they prioritize it when they're just trying to keep the lights on. They're just trying to figure out how they reopen. So those are the 3 that I'll toss out. And then the bigger one to me is the challenge that all organizations are facing or should be facing as we grapple with the difficult history of racism in our country. And I'll just use an example is that in March last year, when we all went home, most of the conversations I was involved in were about a pandemic. Following the murder of George Floyd, we started talking about a double pandemic. And at that moment, I'm often invited to talk in panels and groups such as this. I said, my fear is that we're going to stop calling it a double pandemic. And what you saw occur as we got further and further away from the murder of George Floyd is that we started again referring to a singular pandemic. And I think that there's a danger for our society, but for the arts and culture sector as well, to believe that that pandemic of racism in this country, systemic inequity, has gone away. And so I feel like that is the probably greatest challenge is, can the arts and culture sector, can we as a humanity stay in that difficult space of recognizing this pandemic of racism will continue, systemic inequity will continue, and what are we doing as arts organizations to combat that, to be anti-racist in our work, both internally and what we present to the public?
Yeah, great. Thank you. I thank you all for dropping questions into the chat. We're going to go to questions in just a moment, but Josh, I want to give you an opportunity to also address this issue of what some of the major challenges are going to be.
I will, and I want to build a little bit upon what Brian's wise words touched on. But clearly the challenge is, on one hand, maintaining institutional knowledge. We wound up having to lay off about 85% of our staff. And then as we rebuild and hire people, another challenge is dismantling, recognizing, identifying, and dismantling certain inequitable systems that are present in our organization and in the various sectors that we play in at Seattle Theater Group. And when I say sectors, I mean, we're in the arts, but we're also in Broadway, we're in rock and roll, we're in fine arts, and there are nuanced differences in the various inequitable practices that happen in each of these. There's also a fair amount of shared inequities there. Clearly, diversifying leadership in the performing arts sector, so that people in my roles, in CEO roles, in marketing director roles, in development director roles, becomes critically important. One of the ways that we're looking at that is, in addition to focusing just on our own institution, we've made a real commitment to working with 2 national organizations. One is called the Performing Arts Center Consortium, in which we've joined something called the 30 by 30 effort, which is an effort for, I'd say, the larger performing arts institutions in our country, who right now have about 16% of people of color in roles like mine. Mm-hmm. There is a commitment to make that 30% by 2030. That will be much easier for an organization like Seattle Theater Group to accomplish. We're much closer to 30 already, but for some, they're far from that. Yeah. Some are at 0. Yeah. So we're looking at, I can carry on with other examples like that, but we're looking at larger systems and being involved with them and helping make sure that they become successful, because once that changes, I believe more will change in terms of what you see on stage, yeah, who you see in the seats, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So that to me is the most important challenge.
I apologize for the interjection, but we're going to run out of time and we have quite a few questions. So if we could begin to transition to the Q&A, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
So looking at the questions, let's start with, there are quite a few. I'm going to go to John Bridges' question first. What is the interaction and cooperation between Corporate Council for the Arts, the Seattle Arts Commission, and For Culture? Corporate Council for the Arts is now Arts Fund, and the Seattle Arts Commission and For Culture. Brian, can you respond to that question, please?
I can. Yeah, there's always been cooperation and partnership amongst those different organizations. Of late, this started in 2020. There's been a pivot of this group of cultural funders, and is to solidify what its vision is such that it can act in a more unified fashion. And by that, I mean, each of the funders that participate in that group have their own mission, they have their own vision, they have their own values. The question for this kind of consortium, which we're calling the collaborative, is what are the limited number of things that we can only do together, by banding together, by using our resources together. And there are 3 areas that we are delving into. One of them is advocacy. There's always a need. Our sector struggles to come together in times of challenge to speak with a unified voice about what's necessary. So advocacy is one of the primary planks of that collaborative. The other being better demographic information collection, so that we can understand what our arts and culture sector looks like. What are the boards composed of? What are staffs composed of? What do audiences look like? Are they representative of King County's changing demographics? And then the third is, how can we better share our collective resources such that communities that have historically not known that these funding resources exist and not then been able to avail themselves of it have a better path to do that. So those are the 3 main areas that collaborative is working on right now.
Super, thank you. A question from John Steckler that I think, Josh, you would be best to answer based on the article in the Seattle Times today, speaking to the challenges for arts and music venues, I think specifically, coming out of this pandemic. And it says here, it sounds like turning the proverbial battleship. How long do you think it will take to get our arts programs back up to pre-pandemic levels? Is there anything we, the public, can do to expedite this? Josh?
Yes, it's a great question. And sadly, I really cannot tell you for sure how long it's going to take. There are some people who feel that the older the audience is, the longer it's going to take for a return of the business. I could share with you that at Seattle Theater Group, between September of this year and December of this year, we have 182 performances scheduled. And we do not have a very clear picture on how well attended these performances are going to be quite yet. We're seeing signs that there's a lot of interest. I think I'm going to be bringing, I think from Seattle Theater Group's perspective, I'm going to be bullish and say by the time Hamilton rolls around next year, May, June of next year, I'm hopeful and gonna say that we're gonna be back to our full boat of activity and impact. So that is, you know, a little bit less than a year. And I'm also aware that there are a lot of organizations that do not have the funding to reopen now, and are targeting January. You asked what you guys could do. I'm going to put something right here. That is a piece of legislation from the city. This is an example of the city of Seattle only planning on putting $375,000 towards arts relief funding right now, as opposed to King County, which is putting $30 million towards it. You could go ahead and remind the city that the county should not be shoring up. That does not alleviate the city of their responsibility to help these organizations giddy up and get moving.
Well, thank you. Thank you on Brian's behalf. And I think it's really important too, just to leave a final note that when we talk about pre-pandemic levels, we're talking about arts organizations that are already in many ways function on the margins. If you can't fill the seats, and even when you do fill the seats, you're talking about 50% of what it costs to get butts in the seats. So it's really important that people recognize the necessity for supporting these organizations any way you can. So I've been asked to wrap it up at this particular point. I want to say thank you so much to Brian and to Josh. So good to see your faces. If you all would like to learn more about them and their work, I invite you to go to forculture.org or stgpresents.org. How could I be tripping over that, Josh? And I just say thank you to all of you for having us. And you can also invite these guys to more Rotary meetings. There's another way to get to know what they're up to as well. Thank you all. I think I turn it back over to whomever. Take it away.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Josh.